Good morning, everyone, and a really warm welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about invoicing today. Great to see so many of you joining. I can see everybody jumping on. I'm Liz from Ginger Snap. I'm sure you've seen me and you're probably bored of me by now. I'm an implementation partner, and I'm joined by my lovely wingman, David from Valued. Morning, David.
Hello, Liz. How are you?
Um, I don't know which day it is today because we had a public holiday on Monday and we usually webinar on a Thursday. I'm completely out of sync today. Don't know about
Honestly,
you.
don't. It's a day with a Y, and that'll do fine. But yes, we'll
Feels like
we'll manage. We'll manage.
feels like a Tuesday. Well, today we are joined in the background by Kaya and Natalie and Anita and another David. So they will be hot on the questions today. So fire away as we move through, and obviously
Ably
we'll
supported
get
today.
through. Yeah, very well supported today. So we will answer as many as we can possibly get through. We do have a fair amount packed in for today, so hopefully we won't overrun, but hey, hey, if we do, never mind. So I think most people are on. I'm sure more will join. So let's start talking about invoicing then. So obviously a really important part of Workflow Max. It's how we raise our sales invoices and control how our projects are running in some ways. Let's start with talking about settings because there are some key things behind the scenes that drives the way that invoicing works. So if I head over to my organization settings, in my general tab, if we scroll down firstly to my job section, there are a couple of things here that are important to note. I think the first one to talk about is the task invoice rate. So this is a really important one that enables Workflow Max to work out how much it's going to put on the invoice, how it's going to charge each item of time on an invoice. So we've got task billable rates and staff billable rates. If we're talking about a task billable rate, it means that the rate of that task is the rate on the task is actually driven by the task. So it doesn't matter if David is logging time or I'm logging time, whatever rate is on the task is the one that it will use to calculate the fee on the invoice. Conversely, if we select staff billable rate, then it's the rate of the individual person logging time on that job, which will be presented for invoicing. Whether you invoice it or change the price or whatever you decide to do with that amount, obviously is entirely up to you, but that's how Workflow Max will push values through to your invoice. I mean, most people will set this to the default one that they tend to use the most. That's not to say that every single job must run on one of these types of configuration. Each individual job can run on task or staff, it doesn't matter. This is just a default rate.
Yes.
And it's one that does confuse people slightly, isn't it? And it's quite a fundamental one because it also, we're obviously not going into WIP today, but it does drive what goes into your WIP ledger as well, because it's all linked up: invoicing, estimated billings, and work in progress.
True. I think it's that option of custom rates as well that can often drive the choice. So do you need to set a custom rate per client, or do you need to set a custom rate per staff member? So there can be choices driven around that as well. But you're absolutely right, Liz. It's all down to the individual business.
And we'll have a quick look at custom rates as well, just so you know where they are. And we could probably spend 25 minutes just talking about custom rates, which we can't do today,
Much.
but it's good to have it in the back of your mind. Moving down to our invoice settings, it's good to set a default invoice type. I'll be taking you through the types of invoices you can raise in Workflow Max. And here you can set, if you generally invoice straight off of the time and cost logged, then it's a good idea to set your actual time and cost to be your default type. It just means that when you come to invoice, that option is pre-selected. If you tend to invoice off of quotes or estimated time and costs, then choose the quoted option. You can set your default payment terms here as well. I've got mine set to 14, and then you've got the options about how you want that 14 to calculate, day of the current month, the following month, etc. That's not to say that a particular client, they can still have their own payment terms, but this is, if you have something in here, it will calculate the due date on the invoice. So if I go to my client, Ultra Running, and if I go scroll down to their billing section on the details tab, you can see that I've got a custom invoice due date for this particular client. So I've set them to 21 days. So as always, your organization settings are your defaults, but you can always override them in quite a few different places in Workflow Max. Let's have a look at the last thing I just want to touch on the settings is the edit number sequences at the top of the screen. If you're not connected to Xero, then you will be setting your invoice numbers using your prefix, and your numbering sequence itself will come from Workflow. If you are connected to Xero, you won't actually be using this sequence because it will be Xero who will be giving you your invoice number. But it is a good idea to make sure that your prefix in this section is different from your Xero prefix, just because it's very handy to see if, let's say, an invoice doesn't make it to Xero or there's an issue, it will stay with the Workflow Max invoice ID. Invoice number. Yeah. So it's super confusing if you have the same prefix that I always have INV in Xero. It can be anything, but yeah, keep them very separate. You'll never use it, but it will flag up if there's an issue. It will be easy
Still a
to
good
spot
tip.
that there's an issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So those are our main settings for invoices from our general settings. Let's have a little look at our rates. Where do rates come from? Well, if I'm task billable, they're going to come from our task list here. And when that loads, we can see that obviously for each task, we apply a base rate, which is only used for purposes of quoting, not for when we actually log time, and our billable rate, which is used for the purposes of quoting and for every time somebody logs time on a job. So it's that billable rate on the task that will push through to the invoice. We touched on it before about custom rates. There are a few ways you can customize your rates. You may have custom rates for particular clients. So you may have sort of a rate card per client, in which case you can add your custom rates in here, or you can just go to your client screen and add their custom rates there. It doesn't matter. It does exactly the same thing. You could go one level extra and have custom staff rates for particular tasks. So I could say, well, actually, when Liz is doing app testing and rollout, we don't want to use the standard billable rate. We want to use something different. So you can also specify that there. And you can even change the base rate if you are so inclined, so which is the cost rate. So there's a couple of ways you can change rates. And of course, if you were staff billable, then your rates pull from the staff member's record. So I click into a member of staff. Let's just have a look at director. Whatever is in that billable rate field, that's the one that will be used if you're set to staff billable, and that will go into your WIP ledger, into your estimated billings, and be available for invoicing.
Yeah.
One last thing about rates. If I go into a job, and the last kind of level of rate tinkering, as I sometimes call it, is underneath this financial settings button.
I like that one. Tinkering.
I know. Great tinkering,
one.
Yes, yeah. You can tinker quite a lot with rates, and it can get a little bit confusing, I find. So in my financial settings on the job, I can completely override any other rate that's in the system. Anything I put in here will be applied to this job. So that's kind of like top of the tree rates tinkering, I would say.
This is also where
Um,
you can choose. Yeah, you're just about to have a look at it. Yeah, there you go.
yeah. So before I mentioned that we can have the default staff or task billable, but of course we can change that with every single job, which is quite nice because that we charge our jobs in a variety of ways. So you need that flexibility on a job. So if I
That
change it
one
to
though.
staff, well, I know what you're
Yeah,
going to say, go on.
no, go for it if you're gonna. Yep, you've got it, Liz.
I was just going to say, if you have already invoiced on that job, you will get a little message up here saying, but you've already invoiced on task billable, you can't now change to staff or vice versa. So,
That's
yeah, when you set up your job, just be sure which way you're going to bill it because you can't mess around with different ways of billing once it's in progress.
yeah.
Was that a good technical explanation? You can't mess around
I
with
like that. That works for me.
it. Tinkering and messing around. So those really are that's our background stuff about rates and about how we set things up in preparation for invoicing. Let's think about where we can invoice from, because you can do that from a few different places as well. So as I'm in my job, 207, you can invoice from your job. I would say this is probably the most common place to go and invoice from.
I would agree.
You don't, yeah, because I think mentally you go to your job to raise an invoice, but that's probably why. You don't need to click into financials. You can just use your job actions button, and then you've got your three or your two types of invoice, which we'll be delving into in a minute. So that's straight off the job. You can also invoice from your invoice manager. So you can go to business and invoices and raise an invoice directly off of here. So you can do a progress or a final. Slightly different screen you get from this screen, but does exactly the same as the job. We are offered actual time and costs invoice or a quoted time and costs. Actually, it's the same. We do get the option here, and it's the only place in the system, I believe, where you can do a miscellaneous invoice, which is not
Client
actually
as
a
well.
nice. Yeah, isn't from a client record, yeah.
Yeah.
So just for background information, a miscellaneous invoice is not linked to a job. So if you had to raise an invoice directly to that client for whatever reason, the miscellaneous is the one to use.
Bypasses WIP entirely. It's just nothing
It
to do
does,
with any part of that. It's
yeah.
just I want to raise an invoice for an amount to my client.
Yeah, it's quite handy actually, isn't it? Just to be able
It's
to,
useful in many circumstances, but it's very specific.
especially so I think when you don't have access to Zero. So you literally just need to invoice a fee to a client.
That's the sort of
So
thing.
that's off of our invoice screen. And then the last place you can invoice is obviously straight off your WIP ledger, which is also handy because you're seeing what there is to bill. So for many people, the WIP ledger is the starting point for invoicing. So, most people will be looking down their project list, looking at the WIP. Oh, okay, we've got 40,000 odd of WIP on this one. Let's start billing. So I can either select a single job and click invoice, and it will ask me, is it a progress? Is it a final? What kind of invoice? And do I want it grouped by client or job? You can actually, if you notice, if I click multiple entries here, I can bulk invoice. So if these happen to be the same client, I could create a grouped invoice where both of those projects are going into one single invoice number, which is super handy, especially I've got quite a lot of clients who work with public bodies. So public bodies are very finicky on invoicing and they want every single project on one invoice number, but they do want every single PO number inside that invoice. So that is the perfect way to sort of group that together. I will go through a grouped invoice, but yeah, just to mention it there, that's people that work off of WIP tend to bill from their WIP screen. that's where we can raise our invoices from, entirely up to you, depending on how you like to work. Let's talk about the types of invoices that we have. So we know that broadly, Workflow Max invoices drop into two categories. We've either got a progress invoice, and these are all of the, let's call them interim invoices that we send throughout a job. And depending on how we run our jobs, it might be based on deliverables. Like when you reach a certain stage, you bill. It might be based on amount of time that's been used. So however your job is structured, a progress invoice, you decide when to use that. The final invoice, as the name suggests, is the last one that you're going to issue to the client related to this job. So they both do slightly different things. So the progress invoice, its job is to decrease our estimated billings, because obviously every time we invoice, we're chipping away at our what's on our ledger. So if we have, let's say we have £5,000 on our ledger and we bill 4,000, then estimated billings sits at 1,000. So that's what the progress invoice does. It works away at our estimated billings and our WIP ledger. The final invoice goes one step further, and when we do our final invoice, it does a bit of a cleanup behind the scenes. So it should reduce your estimated billings to nothing, and obviously write off anything from the WIP ledger which you're choosing not to put into your final invoice. So they do slightly different things. Which reminds me, I have forgotten that little setting we were talking about yesterday that we thought was quite handy, and that was, do you remember this one? It is in the organization settings.
I remember which one it was.
Yeah, it is related to what I've just said. So if I go down, if I scroll down to my invoice settings,
of course.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep. And it's
Forgot to
under
mention
job
this one.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, it's moved, it's under job. So this invoice state is quite handy, because if you select a state here, so say I select completed, when I raise my final invoice, if I have something selected here, it will automatically drop the job into completed.
Yes.
Which is quite useful. Some people do their final invoice and say, well, my job's still open. Yes, because you still need to go and close your job after your final invoice. But if you had this set, it would do it for you.
Exactly.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. I think that's most useful if you know that at the end, that's it, it's going to be closed, drop it in the archive. If you do your final invoice, but you know that you've got reconciliation to do, you may have billed your client everything, but you're waiting for supplier stuff to come in or extra bills, then most likely you wouldn't use that, or maybe you put it into a reconciliation status, whichever is most useful for you.
That would be an interesting choice, yes, with the idea of setting up your own job states. You absolutely could.
Yeah, it would be handy, wouldn't it?
Good stuff.
Good. So that's where we can invoice from. We've done our settings in the background. Let's dive into the types of invoices that we can raise. So on my job, make sure I've got the right job. If I go to, let me flip to another job I have here with some stuff on it. So we're going to raise an actuals invoice first and have a look, see how that works. So I've got a job here. This is a job that I literally just charge, let's say, the time and any costs. So it's like a maintenance job. On here, I've got three different tasks that I track, and a couple of fees that I might be accumulating during the month. So if I go to invoice this one, and it's a progress invoice, so we have different options here. So my actual invoice is I'm choosing to basically, you're billing off of your WIP, your work in progress. So everything you've accumulated that month or whatever time frame you're looking at for billing, you can choose to bill the actual hours and the actual costs. So good for people who work on an hourly basis. Obviously, it's not the one you're gonna, if you charge fixed prices and you run off quotes, then this is not the one for you. But let's do an actuals first. The date on the invoice is important because this determines which timesheets and which costs go into the invoice. So if I say everything up to the 28th of August, it will select all of my unbilled time, unbilled costs, up to and including this date. Sometimes when we backdate invoices, we think, oh, there's not enough time in the invoice, and that's because this date parameter is the one that's doing the selection, really. So it will show me my previous invoices here, and then we save to go to be presented with what's left to bill. Remember, the workflow maps will present all of your unbilled stuff, or anything that you've carried forward which is unbilled. In your invoice screen, split up very nicely, we have 3 sections. We are our general invoice information, all the stuff that's come through from our job. Next, we have the actual job with the client order number, if you use that, which is like a purchase order number. And then the last section, the invoice summary, this is the calculations that it does. So what it's telling us is this bill is, our WIP is currently 268.75. And then what we decide to bill will go into this column. Anything that we upcharge or undercharge, if we decide to write something off, will be in this column. Anything we decide not to bill will be part of our carry forwards. So important table here. Our timesheets tab, we've got all of our timesheets in here, anything that's unbilled, and people work differently through these timesheets. So you might have a very long list of timesheets, and you may decide that, yes, you're going to go through each one. And you've got the default, yes, it's billable. If I'm going to write it off entirely, I click no, and that won't be billed. If I want to carry it to next month, I just click future. Be aware that I can't just, if I've got 2.5 hours there, if I just wanted to bill 1.5, it will not carry the 1.5 over. It will write off the 1.5, or the 1 even. So just be aware of that. So I might say, actually, I'm just going to bill 2 hours of that one. So I'm writing down this by ½ an hour, but we'll bill all of that. So anything I change on here gets updated in my details tab. And then that will be the calculations that it's going to use. I don't have to charge this exact amount. As always, I'm in complete control of exactly what I'm invoicing. If you want to change those prices, you would change the pricing mode. So the calculated price mode is the one that Workflow Max, let's say, works out for you. It knows the rates, it knows the time, it'll come up with the total. If you want to override that, then change it to fixed price. And when I do that, that will open up that totals box, and I can charge anything I want here. So I might charge 125 instead. Obviously, it's not going to change the time. You've left the time as it is. You're just overriding the price. Your tax rate will filter in. This is whatever tax rate you use. This is obviously a UK tax rate, but however, whichever tax rates you are using on your Workflow Max account will filter in here. I'm not going to talk about those because David's going to talk about those later on. I don't want to steal your tax thunder. If there's something that I don't want to invoice, I decide that I don't want to invoice this cost, then just simply untick that from the invoice. As I make changes here, this invoice summary will change. So it's telling me, actually, you've given away 12 pounds or £12.50. This is what you're actually billing. And I've got a carry forward cost of 200 because I decided not to bill that. So it's always controlling your estimated billings. So that 200 will stay on my estimated billings until I decide to charge it. Once I'm happy, save and approve. If I have the approve button, then that will send it to 0. If I just have a save button, I don't have the authority to approve, that will just keep it in draft, and then someone else will approve it for me. So that is our actuals invoice. And going back to my point on the I number, look, I've still got my Workflow Max I number for my invoice, and I haven't refreshed this, but as soon as 0 throws back the 0 number, obviously that will change to my usual 0 numbering. So I'll be able to keep tabs on that. So that's my actuals. And if I go back now, just to show you what my estimated billings look like. So on my financials tab, the estimated billings section is where it's keeping track of what is left to bill. Sorry, you were going to say something? No?
No, it's all good. It's looking good.
Okay. So I have my license fee, which I didn't bill. So there we are. That is saved on there for next time. So the financial tab is a great place to come to check what is unbilled on my job. It will all appear in the estimated billing section. I don't have a quote on this job, so that's why it is taking my billings only off of my actuals that are on my job. If I had a quote and I had Workflow Max set that with the little box ticked in the organization settings, it says, if there's a quote on the job, calculate these from the quote, not from my actual time and costs. So it depends what type of job you're running. So that's my actuals invoice. Let's go and have a look at a quoted invoice. So I will dip into a different job. So if I go to job 205, so this is a different piece of work. We've quoted the client a fixed fee, and with fixed fees, often you're not interested in hours. You're not quoting on hours in any way. You're interested in tracking them from a cost perspective, and you may even allocate time, as I have. I've given the team an estimate, but my feed is not really it doesn't really track back to hours. So that's when I'm using really my quote. So on my financials, I've got my quote set up. And then when I use my quoted invoicing, what I'm interested in doing is drawing down from this quote. Well, I could either bill each of these lines in one go, or I could say, actually, when we've delivered our first deliverable, we'll charge 2,500 to the client, and our second deliverable will be a 5,000 payment, etc. So I'll be wanting to draw down from here. And what I want from my estimated billings is I want it to keep track of what I have left. And I also want it to tell me anything with this line through that tells me, hey, there's a cost on the job that wasn't in your quotation. So that's also useful. Note that it's not actually putting it into my estimated billings, because it's still doing my billings off the quote, but it's telling me what I've spent and what the unit price would be. So with my progress invoice on this one, I'm actually going to do a drawdown off of my quote. So I'm going to use the quoted and estimated time and costs. Now the date here is my invoice date. It's not going to select timesheets in this case, but it is the date I want on my invoice. And that will become my date in my WIP ledger. So here is my items in my quote. Now I've got these boxes open on fixed price. Now, if you want to draw down from a quote and you don't want to bill each stage in its entirety, you must use the fixed price mode. And you must, when you issue and accept your quotation, do that in fixed price mode, and that will carry through to your invoice. That's super important. Otherwise, you won't be able to do what I'm just about to do.
That's a biggie, that one. Yep.
It is, isn't it? Often people will create the invoice. There's nothing on my invoice because it didn't know that it had to do it in fixed price mode. So let's say we're not interested in any data analysis for the moment, but I do want to bill 2,500 of my project management. So I can do that. And also it's going to highlight in yellow, hey, you've got an extra cost here. It wasn't on your quote, and I can choose to uncharge that, or I can leave that till the end of my final invoice on my tidy up. So there's my interim invoice, 2,500. I can approve that. And then when I come to do my next invoice, it's going to be that, however much it was, 8,750 minus that 2,500 is what I have left to bill. So if I hop back to my job now, my estimated billings, if I go to financials, there we are. So I now have 8,000 left to bill on that. And I haven't charged any of this one. So I've still got 16 and I haven't done the site travel. So each time it's just drawing down from my quote. So that's my fixed price. I don't have to use fixed price in quoted billing. I can use calculated, but if we want the drawdowns, then fixed price is what it's got to be.
That's the one.
Let's look at a couple of other types of invoice. So you may not want to bill off hours. You may not, maybe you don't want to bill off of a quote. You just want to bill something. Actually, before I do that, let me just show you the other way of billing off of the quote. So I build actual line items from my quote. You don't have to do that. You can just take percentages from your quote if you wanted to. So I've lost my percentages now, haven't I? Because I've already billed off of my quote.
Just, have we got another quote example?
Yes, let's have a look. I've probably got another one somewhere. Maybe that one.
True
So
Blue
I may, well, we'll see now, won't we? I may want to build 20% as an initial deposit.
Nope.
No, I haven't got my percentage. I don't know why.
You go through business and quotes and see if you got an accepted quote.
Yeah.
Talk about whether we've still got something to invoice.
We could just accept this one.
Yep, go for it. Yep, accept it and it'll work.
There's my quote. And then if I go to progress, there we are. So my other option, if I didn't want to do line by line, I can just nibble off chunks of my quote. So I can default this to a percentage, which I can put in my invoice settings in the background. But I may just say I want 25, and it may be a deposit invoice. Click save. Again, that date is the one that goes into your work in progress. Workflow Max will then just work out the percentage of the quote. So the client is not getting the details of, oh, we've done A, B, and C, and we're invoicing you a proportion of each, but here you are, here's a percentage of the contract that we issued you. So that's the other way of doing a quoted invoice. You're still running off your contract, but just a percentage. So we just got a one-line invoice. Our next way of invoicing is we may just want an amount. We may just say, well, actually, I'm not working off of either of those, and we just need to bill this amount. So I can do that, and that will produce me a one-line invoice that will go across to zero just with a single item on it. And this description box here, you can configure. So if you go into your cost database, if I show you that briefly. And if I go to, if you create an item, if you put the code as progress-invoice, see if I can find mine. It's quite good that you can search on code or name in the cost, isn't it?
Definitely helps.
Yeah, there's my cost code progress invoice, and I've called it stage payment, but you can configure it to whatever you want. A lot of clients will put this as they always invoice the 40% up front, so they'll have a phrase here that is the amount they're going to charge. Just makes it one less thing to type out, really. So there's my progress amount. And there we are. Similar to the other one, we just get, it can be slightly confusing. It is actually a cost because it's an invoice cost that has no cost. It's just a price. It's just something we're charging. So that's our single line invoice. When we come to do our final invoice, anything that we've taken up front will be subtracted from that final invoice. So it will still balance out nicely. So I can approve that one. Over that goes to 0.
Great stuff.
Yep. And then if we come to do our final invoice, let's just have a look at what that looks like. Go to my job. And again, I can obviously do this from anywhere that we saw before. If I do final invoice. So I'm basing it on my quote. It knows what I've billed before. So now it will present me with the final amount that's left to bill on that quote. So I've got my 8,000, my 16,895. I've still got this cost sat here, this site travel. And even though I may not want to actually invoice that, as in I'm not going to charge the customer, I'm going to put it on my on my final invoice because I want this to be taken off of my WIP ledger because this is my final, let's say, wash up of my job, really. Would you agree?
I would, absolutely. We don't want it hanging around afterwards.
Yeah, and a mistake that some people make is when they do their final invoice, because they don't want this to appear, they will leave it as they will leave it unticked, which means it sticks on the WIP ledger. So you then have to go and remove it from the WIP ledger. But once I save and approve that, and I go and look at my estimated billings, let's see what they look like. So I've really told Workflow Max, that's it. We've billed the whole lot. Yeah. And of course, anything that I now add to this job will go back on my ledger. There we are. Nothing left to bill. So I can see I've got a progress and I might have lots of those and I've got a final. So that's the tidy way to wrap up your job so that there's nothing left on the WIP ledger. So no one thinks there's anything to bill and nothing left in your estimated billings. And obviously, and David will go through this in a second, but you can choose how you want to present those invoices via your custom templates. And you might say, well, my final invoice, I don't want all those costs to appear where I've got 0. So you can configure your templates not to show those if you wish.
Yes, fun and games with custom templates.
You love them, come on.
I do.
You do. The last thing I'm going to show before I hand over to you is let's just have a quick look at a grouped invoice. So I think I've got a job for this. Yes, I do. So I think I can do it from here. If I do a progress invoice.
Huh?
I can, yep. So I'm going to select my client first. I think it was Brightside, yeah. So I'm doing a job invoice. Obviously, I want it off my WIP, and it will present me with the jobs that still have stuff left on them. I can still do an actual or a quoted, but remember that however you build these before, you need to keep billing them in the same way. Or better said, all our jobs in here will be billed in the same way. You can't mix up. This one will be actual and this one will be quoted. So
it can lead to trouble.
we know all about that, don't we? Because I think we lived through that in a previous Workflow Max world as well.
We did, which shall remain nameless.
Yes. Who shall not be named. So now I have an invoice, but I've got my header here, so that stays the same. And then I've got job 207, and then I've job 206. So they're both going to be attached to exactly the same invoice number. And I can still put my client order numbers here. When it goes over to 0, one single invoice number. When the payment comes back from the client, it will be apportioned to the relevant jobs. I can still do everything I did before, so I could still invoice part of a stage if I wanted, or a full stage. So there's no difference to the way it is. It's just grouping it all into one invoice, which is a huge time saver if you have clients that some of my clients have.
Very much so.
So, my friend, I hand over to you, and I believe
Yes,
you're
indeed.
going to trickle off with tax, aren't you?
Let me share my screen. So let me just, so can you knock off your screen share, Liz, and I'll jump mine on. There we go. Let's just share what we've got there. So here we are, folks. Yeah, thank you very much for the detail there, Liz. As you can see, there is a lot of choice when it comes down to how you raise your invoices and how they're going to work for you. We've got a few remaining topics to cover here, and I'm just aware that time is moving on a little bit, so I'm going to just work my way through these in about 10 minutes. But the good news is none of these are particularly complex, which is the good news. First of all, tax. When we're talking about tax in Workflow Max, where do we find that? Well, if we go into your business and settings, your organization settings is where we will find your tax rates. Now, if you're not linked to Xero, you will have a minimal series of tax rates presented to you. You can add as many as you need to, and you can configure those yourself. If you are linked to Xero, as I am here, then what it will do is mirror and sync all of the tax rates that you've currently got in your Xero system and present them to you here. So this is the benefit, or one of the benefits, of integrating with Xero, is that it helps to take control of that tax position. Whenever we are raising an invoice to a client, we then have the option of the tax that comes through. There's a few places that we can control what those taxes are. The first one, if I was to look into either my tasks or costs, we would see that I have an ultimate level of override that I can apply within these items. So if I go into any one of my tasks within my list, so if I go into project setup, for example, then I will be able to see that I have mention of my tax rates right there. So there I could override it to a specific tax rate if I needed to. We'll have a look at the actual Xero integration settings in just a minute, but this gives me great flexibility in saying whether some items should be taxed at one rate and other items at a different rate. Do be very, very careful in terms of whether you're using tax rates for expenses or income. Certainly when it's something that you're selling, so an invoice tax rate, make sure that it's your incomes. If it's something that you're buying, and again, it's the costs that would be most relevant there, you'll see that we have both types of tax available to us there, both, let's have a look at one of these there. If I just go into floors, we'll see that we have both an income account and a cost of sale account in terms of our items there. But we also then have those different tax rate, tax on invoices and tax on purchases. So again, purchases need to be your expenses, invoices need to be your income. If you get those the wrong way around, it can lead to all sorts of confusion. In terms of the integration settings, you can see that in this same business and settings menu, we have integrations listed just there. When we click into it, there is our Xero option. And if we've set this up, we can see our default settings in terms of our connection. So there we would have not only our default income account and cost of sale account, but also our default tax rates as well. So again, yes, we're in the UK here. So you can see that in terms of our tax, we've got our sales tax and our purchase tax set up appropriately. The only other level of override that we will come across will tend to be at job level. So we can have certain overrides for our invoicing at job category level. So if I go into a particular job category, I will be able to see that within the details of the category itself, I've got options for, there it comes, the income account and the cost of sale account there. Notice that there's no tax rates in here. It's just about those account codes that we're using here. So whether it be I'm using the same as my default, I wouldn't need to include it at that point. Or if I have an override, I can choose whatever override I want for both sales and purchases. So in terms
good
of
option, this, isn't it?
it's a really useful, particularly if we're in the habit of adding cost items on the fly. When we come to look at an invoice in a minute, we'll see that there's certain restrictions in terms of what we're adding in terms of a cost item. So if I was to go into any draft invoice, doesn't matter which one it is, if I was dealing with my tasks and costs as they came through, so those, whether they're coming from a quotation or whether they're coming from actual time and costs, then those task items, they would be looking at those levels of override. Do we have something against the task, or do we have something against the job, or are we just relying on the default connection? In terms of our cost items, the same is true. You can see here we've got our tax rate listed there. This would be based on either the default override or the job level information, or if we've got a cost saved in our cost list in the background. So again, this list of costs that we've got in here, this is really useful for helping us set up things in advance, particularly to do with our account codes, those sale or purchase codes that we're putting the item to. If, on the other hand, this item was just added on the fly, so if I was adding an item just here, if I say I need to search for new cost and it doesn't exist, while I can say how much it is and what it should be, I can't set any other override in terms of my account codes. So I'm relying then on either the job override or just my default connection. But if I add something in here, it will calculate my markup for me as well if I want it to. But there I do then have the ability to select which tax treatment I want to put it to. So if that was 5% on income, absolutely fine. And we can save that into our invoice. So once that has then presented itself to us, we can go ahead and we can approve that, and it will send it across to Xero for us. So quickly coming back, so that's hopefully given you an idea in terms of taxes and where they can be found within the system. Custom invoice templates are another item entirely. So again, within our settings, when we come back to our option under business and settings, we have this feature tab at the top. The second item in there is where we can control the template document that we use to present our invoice to our client. Without any of these set up, the system does have its own default, which can be branded. At least it can have your logo put on it, but it's still a very simple, very basic looking template. There are a series of sample templates that you can access, so you don't have to start these from scratch. My best advice, if you're new to this, is use one of these sample invoice templates and begin with that and start adding to that to produce the results that you want. Once you have then customized your document, see that I won't show you today, but it is basically a Word template using merge fields. So if you're used to merge documents, it's nothing new there. But then what we will be able to do is use that document to build our template. So within the template record, we have some controls in here. So we can again give it a description to help us. We give it a name. We can say when we need to make it usable by or from, and we also need to make sure that it is flagged as active. Otherwise, it simply won't appear in our list of options when we come to print our invoice. We can also use some of these settings to decide how we are presenting items within that invoice. So are we removing empty tables? So if we have no tasks or no costs, do we want to present a table with nothing in it? Not really. Do we want to group items of a similar name or of a similar cost type, etc.? So again, if we're streamlining the content of that invoice. And again, what information do we want to include in terms of timesheets? Are we including none of them, all of them, or the various details that we see there? At the bottom is our ability to upload that template into the system, and the upshot of that is that any invoice that I have raised to my client, I can now print. So if I choose to print my invoice, one moment please, we will see that we get a series of options presented to us. So this is looking at the last template that I used. So I can choose whatever template I wish to deal with in terms of that. You can see that that is presenting the image to us that we have there, or I can choose any other different type of template. So you might have different templates for different purposes. Here is the default option. You'll see that this gives you a whole bunch of selectable options within it. These are not present in your custom templates because your custom templates you will have already configured with the options that you want. If I just click on generate for my default template, we'll see how different that is. That is just a plain old template there. Nothing particularly special there, just very basic look, even though we've got quite a lot of flexibility over what we include. So in terms of invoice templates, again, do have a look at those and make sure that you're satisfied that you've got what you need to present to your client. The idea now of syncing invoices. So we've talked about the integration with Xero. There can be times where there will be problems with that. If you've sent your invoice to Xero by clicking approve, we would normally expect it to land in Xero either as a draft invoice or as an awaiting payment invoice. So if we were looking at your dashboard, usually they come through as drafts. It depends on how people set them up, but you would then be able to click into your list of invoices and see those that have come through. So I've got a couple of examples in here. We would see that these examples, certainly the Time Villas one, I raised that this morning and it's already appeared in Xero. However, there are a couple of circumstances that may prevent them from coming through to Xero. In your invoices list, so under business and invoices, if you see next to this second tab, you've got your overview with your list of invoices, but under Xero exports, if there's a little number there, we've got some problems to address. So click into that tab and we will see a list of any Xero exports which have failed. So when we click through, there's our failed list. I can look at it in here and I will find them, but it's far easier just to click into the tab and see what has gone wrong. And what we will see is that we should have those items listed with their exceptions. So if I now hover over where it gives me the reason, so sync failed, and it's telling me what is wrong with these items. So here it failed because the contact in Xero, so Man v Food is my client in Workflow Max, is my contact in Xero. It's saying that this is currently archived. It can't export an invoice to an archived customer. So I would then need to go into Xero. I would then need to go into my contacts and I would need to inspect my archive and I would need to have a look at that and make sure that under my archived clients, oh, there's Man v Food. I would want to restore this to my main list. Now, if you've got two records of the same name, you can merge them in Xero, that's fine. But that is getting around the issue that we encountered here. There can be all sorts of different reasons why we might have a problem. So again, here it's just saying that it's the same reason because it's the same client. Another common one that we will find is if any of the account codes have been archived as well. So do look at that in terms of what your integration settings are with Xero. If you've then at some point updated your chart of accounts. So if I look down in Xero under my accounting heading, go to chart of accounts, and you may find that under your chart of accounts, you might have a number of archived accounts that you might wish to address. So as far as that, click into your archive tab. And if for any reason there's something here that's been archived for whatever reason, we either need to take account of that in our Xero settings, or we may indeed need to restore that back to our live accounts to be able to overcome some of these errors. Once you've made your corrections, done whatever you needed to do, you can select them and you can resync them. And this should then ultimately remove these errors. It will push them through to Xero successfully and everything will be right. There are improvements happening with the integrations all of the time. There was prior to very recently a situation where if you had an incorrect tax code on an item within Workflow Max, so for example, an expense code on an invoice, then that would also trigger a problem. At the moment, it's looking like that will go through and be automatically corrected for you. So again, have a look at that, but do keep an eye on your fails and have a look at those error or comments whenever you need to. Importing payments. It's very simple. You don't need to worry about manually adding payments to your invoices in Workflow Max. It is possible. If I come back to an invoice and look at my payments tab that we will see within here, then absolutely I can click into that payments tab and I can manually add a payment to say, yes, I've received that money. Why do that if the system will do it for you? So again, if we have a look at your settings, if we go back into your connection settings for Xero, we'll see that there is a flag within there that allows it to import those payments automatically for you. So as we scroll down, we'll see within here, it's towards the bottom of that first section. Just let that come up. So as I move down, we can see that we've got the invoice details and right there, invoice payments automatically import your payments from Xero. By default, I would suggest that you tick that. I can't think of it. Liz, can you think of any reason why we wouldn't tick that? I can't. I certainly can't.
No.
So make sure that that is ticked within your Xero integration settings. Credit notes. Here's an interesting one. Credit notes are certainly a function within Xero. They don't really exist within Workflow Max, the name of a credit note as such. They are something that you can produce within Xero by an action within Workflow Max, but it won't call it a credit note as such. So looking at, have I got one that I've got prepped? Let me just see. Can you see that in my invoice, I have an item here for a refund? So let's see. Now, again, somebody did raise a question about refunds. This is a way that you could handle refunds within Workflow Max. So I've got an invoice right now. My job itself had a cost item with a negative quantity. Now, this is the only way that you can raise a negative value item in Workflow Max. So right now, I'm not going to invoice for all of these. I'm only going to invoice for some of them. So let me just see which ones I want to get rid of. Let's just make sure this is the invoice and it is a draft. So that's fine. I'm going to remove these items. I was going to see, is it doing it? All right. No, I've already, this is my job. Okay, so let's raise the invoice. So if I go into my progress invoice, we will be able to include any or all of these items as we see fit. So again, I will raise this for actuals, and bearing my date in mind, we'll have a look at what we've got in our invoice. I'm just going to invoice for that refund item at this stage. That's the only one that I've got. You can see that it's producing a negative value invoice here. So again, it would be going to an appropriate account code. It's got an appropriate tax treatment. As soon as I approve this, let's see what that then does. This will and should produce a credit note within Xero. You can see that as far as my invoice is concerned, it's got currently my Workflow Max invoice number. As soon as the connection has been made with Xero, and as soon as the invoice number has been brought back through from Xero, this will update. So let's just give that a few seconds to update and we'll see what we've got. Time is marching on, so I do appreciate that we've got that. Can you see how that's now produced not an invoice number, but a credit note number? If I look back at Xero, and if I refresh my list, we're going to see that it has now produced, or it should have produced, a credit note for me. So if I come back to my dashboard and my draft items, there indeed is my note for 120. So that's exactly what we wanted to achieve there. So again, the downside is we can't match this up to an invoice in Workflow Max. So it may be that on occasions like that, you need to simply cancel a previous invoice, or again, once you've taken any other payments against it, you might then remove the remaining balance against that. Your options in your invoicing, you've got quite a number of options with regard to those. So certainly those are ways that you can handle not only refunds, but credit notes within Workflow Max.
It just doesn't take it off the whip, does it? As in,
well, no, this is the only thing. Again, you've certainly your negative cost item is going to be included as part of your WIP total.
Yeah.
You just need to make sure that you're managing it appropriately, but it doesn't balance off one against the other until you've essentially included it against other items. So you would need to have, different items in the same invoice in order to essentially mark them as invoiced against each other. Let's have a quick look at cancelled versus deleted. You'll saw there that within any of my invoices, it doesn't matter whether it's a credit note or not, that I have two choices. I can either cancel an invoice or I can delete an invoice. If I delete the invoice, it does exactly that. It removes it from Workflow Max without any trace. However, it has absolutely no impact on Xero. So your invoice that was pushed through to Xero will still be there. You would need to go and void it manually within Xero. However, if I cancel my invoice in Workflow Max, that will indeed go across to Xero and void the counterpart invoice in Xero itself. So again, a very good way of streamlining your process. In either instance, it will remove those items from the invoice and throw them back into your WIP ledger, so you will have them available to invoice again. The other benefit of the cancelling of an invoice is that it does leave an audit trail. You will see that cancelled invoice sitting in your system. Now, some people find that confusing. Others prefer to have it there for record-keeping purposes. It's entirely up to you. But that is the difference between cancelling or deleting an invoice. Finally, I want to mention the troubleshooting guides. within Workflow Max itself, so if I just come back to my dashboard or any screen within Workflow Max, you can see that you've got your question mark down at the bottom corner. If I was to click into that question mark, I then get my troubleshooting guides. If I click into troubleshooting, it takes me through to the support center, and here are my troubleshooting guides. Right away, there is our invoicing guide. So you can access that and go through all of the content there to help you understand about invoicing and where problems might occur that you can rectify. But I very much would guide you towards that in terms of helping you identify and solve your problems within the system. Oh my goodness, apologies about blasting that. We are a little bit, we're bang on 10 o'clock now. Let's have a look and see if there's got any questions that we can follow up on in terms of this. I think, how are we doing
They've been
on that?
busy in the background, very busy.
They have. They've definitely helped us out. So thank you very much, folks. You've done us proud.
Yeah. Should we pick a couple before we go?
Yeah, I was going to say, let's see if there's something there that we can answer.
Portia's asking about pro forma invoices. That's sometimes something people want to do.
What can we say about that then?
Well, I was thinking what you could use maybe a quote custom template instead of an invoice template for that, because you're not raising an actual invoice number, are you? That's how I've seen it used before.
The only other time that I've seen it worked something slightly differently is when people use a draft invoice and send a draft invoice. That can be problematic. In the system, you can only have one draft invoice in a job at any one time. If you have more, or if you try and raise a second draft invoice, it will say, no, you can't. You've already got a draft invoice. So while it works up to a point, it might not be perfect. But certainly the idea of the quote template, I think that could be quite useful.
Yeah. Gosh, can we pick another one?
Can we show how to suppress a line item with 0 values on an invoice?
This is the final invoice. I think it was the final invoice template, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, so the clients that I have, they'll have the final invoice template will pick up the there'll be some narrative and the actual amount for the final invoice, but they won't list everything out on that final invoice because they know that they're clearing WIP for the items they're not going to charge. Or the other way to do it, Anne, is to, if there are cost items at 0, then adjust your template not to read the 0 value cost items. You'll still get you will still get an empty row in the table, so you'd need to export it to Word and remove the empty rows. But you're telling Word, if it's got nothing in it, don't print this line, and that's a way to suppress the 0 items.
Good one on that one. Let's have a look. Just seeing again, what have we got? Any quick wins that we've got here? How
someone did ask about.
Yeah. Sorry, yes, which one, Liz?
I was just looking in the answered questions. Someone's asking about how to do discounts, and they're actually very similar to the way you did the credit note, so that
absolutely.
You could discount on a quote or an invoice, can't you, using a negative item?
Yeah, it's the easiest and most obvious way to do it. There's no way in Workflow Max to discount on the same line. So I can't say, well, this line is 1,000 and I'm discounting it by 10% for you. There's no function to do that. But you can absolutely have another line that says, here's my discount of 100, and you can display that very clearly to your client. So absolutely. The subtotal on invoices is calculated based on the values that you've presented. So again, in terms of whether you're using either calculated or fixed price, it will absolutely look at the combined totals of any tasks or costs within there and present it to you as your subtotal. It will then look at adding your tax on to UK based. But yeah, in terms of subtotal, it's a perfectly built-in calculation. Absolutely.
I think one thing I didn't mention was if you're on Xero Premium and you have the same regular invoices going out every month, then you can use recurring invoices in Xero tagged to your job number, and then those will pull over to your Workflow Max job. I think there was a question that just popped up. You know, if we've got the same invoice from the previous month, can we copy it? You can't copy an invoice, but if you're on Premium, you could import them from Xero. Handle them in Xero as recurring. Yeah.
Yep, that's the best way to do it, and it is one of the benefits of the premium features within Workflow Max. So if you do have a lot of those happening, then absolutely for a minimal additional cost, the premium version will work in spades for you. It'll be great.
Yeah.
We are unfortunately over time by nearly 5 minutes, so I do apologize for keeping people hanging around. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope you found it useful. Liz, sterling job. Thank you very much
You
for
too.
all of
Thank you.
part there. Thanks for your attendance, everybody. Yes, we look forward to seeing you again. Obviously, we will be running the invoice session again in the future at some point, but yeah, we have many other topics that we will be covering as well. We will see you soon. Thanks for that. Take care.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.